Today's UARA Tech Tip comes to you once again from the offices of Carolina Racing Supply, home of Tomcat Performance in Mooresville, North Carolina. Today we're going to talk about springs. I'm going to try to keep this short because, yes, I realize springs is a very, very in-depth topic if you talk to any sort of racer anywhere in any type of race car. Between 4 springs, 4 shocks, and the sway bar, not to mention those 4 round rubber things called tires, you can completely change the handling of a race car, and you've got a whole specialty just in springs alone. So we'll try to keep it simple and short, give you a little bit of information about different types of springs and kind of how they work on some of these UARA Stars late models. One thing you might hear us talk about a lot of times are coilover cars and big spring cars. What's the difference? Well, a coilover, obviously the spring is much smaller. The inner diameter is much smaller, and of course the overall profile of the spring generally is smaller as well. A coilover goes on the shock. The shock assembly goes through this spring, and it's all one assembly. There's a little nut on top of this. You'll crank on to adjust the right height of the spring, the preload, and help set your car up. This is a big spring. Much like the name implies, it is a bigger spring, usually a 5-inch spring. You can see it's got a much wider diameter, and depending on where it is in the car, it actually a lot of times can be taller or shorter if it's in the front of the car than a coilover spring. One reason a lot of racers like big springs, because what they call tensile strength. They look at the tensile strength and a lot of the bound up energy in the spring and say, there's less energy bound up in the spring, I can make it do things a lot better than I can one of these. On the flip side, a lot of people like coilover springs better. Why? Because the coilover spring is more closely connected to something they call the wheel rate on the race car. In other words, an adjustment here is a lot more precise than an adjustment on one of these. Take your pick. There's various schools of thought on the whole issue. Something else you're also going to hear about a lot of times are something called spring rubbers. Now, most of the times teams use those in the rear of the cars now, not so much the front as they used to. A coilover spring rubber looks like this, except it actually is cut to fit in between the spring. And a big spring rubber, very similar, just bigger. They, of course, fit in between these coils. Now, if you look real closely, here's how you can tune your spring rubbers, and teams will do a lot of this testing to know what their spring is going to do. You can look at the thickness of the spring rubber. A thinner spring rubber is going to have a smaller rate or a lesser rate. Therefore, it's softer. You can also tune using the actual hardness of the rubber itself. Same type of deal. You look for a harder rubber, it's a higher rate. A softer rubber is a softer rate, more pliable, has a little bit more give whenever the spring tries to move. The other thing you're going to hear, and you may be familiar with over the years, is something called coil binding. And you might wonder, what is coil binding? Some of our teams use coil binding in the front, some use bump stops. Bump stops, a completely different subject. We can get into it another time. But coil binding, while we're here, I'll kind of show you what that is. When you coil bind, you look at what's called the free height of the spring. This spring happens to be 12 inches tall. When you coil bind, you take this spring, and I'm not even going to try because I'm not Superman, but you completely compress this spring down to where literally these coils are touching. And what teams will do to try to figure out all this stuff, they'll take that spring, they'll measure the free height, they'll measure the distance between the coils, they'll measure the actual distance when the spring is compressed, all these different measurements, and they're looking for literally tenths and hundredths of an inch, because when that spring hits and it actually binds, there's no more give. The spring is solid. It's like putting a 2x4 or a steel rod in the front or the rear of the car, wherever you're coil binding at. So coil binding is a lot more difficult, but it is something a lot of teams do, and those are a lot of the measurements they look at, either on a coilover or on a big spring. And for that matter, on the big spring, you can cock the spring sideways, you can make it twist, you can do everything. A coilover spring, for the most part, pretty much linear. You only can coil bind it completely or not at all, unlike some of these big springs. So as you can see, springs are a completely different specialty area in and of themselves, and that's one reason that teams pay so much attention to the fronts and the rear of these cars when it comes to springs and what they have on there, and why a lot of the crew chiefs are so picky. And you know what? The ones that tend to be the pickiest usually tend to be the ones that are up front.